We're delighted to be here today to celebrate Love Data Week with a collaborative podcast produced by the UK Data Service and Closer. I'm Rodney Appleyard from the UK Data Service, and presented with me today is Jenny Blows from Closer.
Thanks, Rod. So joining us on the panel today is Jennifer Symonds, newly appointed Director of Closer, and she was previously Director of Growing Up in Digital Europe, which is Europe's first longitudinal population study of children and young people. Jennifer was also Joint Director of Ireland's national cohort study of primary schooling, called Children's School Lives. We're also joined by Robin Flaig, Co-Director of the UK Longitudinal Linkage collaboration and the COO of Generation Scotland based at the University of Edinburgh. And we also have with us Nigel de Noronha, a research associate for the UK Data Service, who's an expert on the census and the EVEN study, which is the largest research project ever conducted on the lived experience of ethnic minorities in the UK. So the theme of this year's Love Data Week is My Kind of Data, and will focus on people's personal stories of being involved in data, as well as the issues around data equity, inclusion, disciplinary communities, and creating a kind of world through data.
So to start off the discussion today, I'd like to ask you all, starting with Jennifer, if you could share some background of your career so far and how you became involved in the world of data.
Sure, thank you, Rodney. So I've had three main stages in my career that have all been dealing with a different kind of data. And as you introduced me, and thank you for that, currently I'm Director of Closer, which is the UK's Cohort and Longitudinal Studies Enhancement Resources Centre at University College London, funded by the ESRC. And Closer works to promote the utility and widespread usage of longitudinal population studies data. Prior to being Director of Closer, I had a career in cohort study management and questionnaire design and data collection. So lots of large-scale data collection and fieldwork in cohort studies. And then prior to that, the other stage of my career, I spent a very long time becoming expert in analysing secondary data from cohort studies research after I completed my PhD.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So Robin, please tell us about your career background too.
So I have a slightly unusual background. My degrees are in history. So I did an undergraduate degree in history and then a master's in history at Tufts University, where I looked at midwifery and witchcraft in late medieval and early modern Europe. So that didn't involve huge amounts of data, although it did involve some. I went off into the world of work and ended up getting jobs in clinical trials and data management. And actually, they started hiring more historians because they have a really good attention to detail. I then moved with my husband off to Australia and worked on consultancy around biotechnology, just quite a random thing. I really struggled to find a job for quite some time in the UK and then managed to get a maternity cover job to work on a clinical trial for which I was eminently qualified. It was a trial looking at feeding of stroke patients. And that got my foot in the door at the University of Edinburgh. And I've worked for the university ever since on a kind of escalating series of interesting jobs around data. So I worked for that clinical trial for less than a year and then moved to work on the Scottish stroke care audit for 10 years, which was an audit of stroke care and how it was doing across Scotland, across all the hospitals in Scotland. And then I moved from that to work for UK Biobank. And that was my first foray into the world of longitudinal population studies. And because I had experience with data collected by government, I was hired to help UK Biobank link to that kind of data. And also our team up in Edinburgh at the time, which was led by Professor Kathy Sudlow, looked at how you made sense of the data. So we had a whole bunch of clinicians working to try and take codes that appear in data and make them into actual conditions that researchers could research. And so I worked with clinicians and data scientists and managed projects, and then worked with the NHS in England, Scotland, and Wales to try and link UK Biobank data. And then in 2019, I moved to research management of Generation Scotland, which is Scotland's largest family longitudinal population study. And then the pandemic hit, and Generation Scotland became very involved in the pandemic response. And as a result of that, I worked closely with Andy Boyd from the University of Bristol, and we got funded to create the UK Longitudinal Linkage collaboration, which brings together longitudinal population studies with linked records, primarily at this point healthcare, but we have permissions to link to DWP, tax records, educational records. So that's my career in data science. I facilitate others to be able to do research on these data.
Brilliant. That's a fascinating answer there. Thank you very much for that. Now over to Nigel.
Well, I've got a very checkered career. I suppose I started working in IT many years ago and kind of worked with information there in commercial and public sector organisations with a spell of teaching in a college in the middle to accommodate my kind of personal needs in terms of childcare. I then went to work for the Audit Commission, and in that role, I got involved in national research on a couple of projects. One was the Journey to Race Equality, where we went and talked to various bodies and local public sector bodies about how they were responding to the 2000 Race Relations Amendment Act. I also worked on a project called Area Profiles, which was the precursor of trying to bring together a set of indicators that help people make sense of their area. So it was in the days where councils were asked to be in partnerships, and we amassed a kind of model of what you know about an area. And my particular role was to look at what that means from different perspectives. So to help a colleague who was working on older people to work on Black and minority ethnic, as we called that population then, and to work locally with local partnerships who were kind of interested in that area. When we were shut down by the coalition government, I came to Manchester University to do a master's and then a PhD. And I suppose my interest was about places that have always been hard to describe, places where there's high levels of transience. And I started off with that, but then moved on to focus on housing, which was a kind of key indicator, and looking at the private rented sector. I completed that in 2016, taught for about 5 years, continued my research interest in housing, race and migration, and came and joined the UK Data Service in 2020, where ended up taking the lead on census data, microdata specifically, but also on training researchers and those outside in the broader public and voluntary sector in the use of census data, work with the voluntary sector and our reach as the UK Data Service into the voluntary sector. And I've inherited an expertise, I suppose, in equality in general because of my previous experiences, and also in policy because of my closeness to kind of understanding, I suppose, of what national policy and local policy is like. So as well as working for the UK Data Service, I frequently end up in projects with the Centre on the Dynamics of Ethnicity, which is an ESRC funded centre. And the latest thing we're doing with them, talk about a bit later, is the new data set they've just deposited with us.
Thank you so much, Nigel.
With you each working with data in such different ways, we'd love to understand a little bit more about what you found to be most satisfying from working with data in the ways that you do, particularly in terms of how data improves other people's lives and how we can enhance inclusivity through using data. Starting with Nigel, what would you say have been the highlights for you?
It is gratifying to now be seen as an expert. I was asked to do the keynote speech at the Housing Studies Association last year. I'm regularly called on in Greater Manchester by housing researchers here to talk about how they're going to design a piece of research. So it does feel like, on a personal level, my expertise is validated and useful to people, and the feedback from those kind of interventions is generally pretty positive. So I would say, on a personal level, yes, I feel like I'm making some difference, but I still think that difference is shifting other people to do the right thing.
And Robin, what have you found most satisfying from your work with people with strokes and general health?
So I think, seeing improvements in stroke care in Scotland was quite rewarding. And, I think the thing is that research changes what is best practice. And I think it's really important to make sure that so inclusivity from my perspective from that was making sure that rural areas and big cities had equitable care, for example, and even looking at, Orkney and Shetland and the Western Isles, what kind of care did their patients get as opposed to if you fell down with a stroke in Glasgow. Those kinds of things are really important to report on to make sure there is equity across the country in care. I think the other thing that's quite rewarding is actually to see the publications. So, I worked for UK Biobank for 7 years and did a lot of work around linking to general practice data, made sure that they were able to link to both England, Scotland, and Welsh data. And I can hear a news report and I can say that's UK Biobank data, and I will have assisted in that research, even though it's completely unbeknownst to them. And that's quite satisfying. And it's similar with Generation Scotland as well. I feel like we're trying to recruit younger people to Generation Scotland now, so age 12 and up. And, listening to some of the people who've joined and their passion for supporting health research is just hugely rewarding.
Thanks, Robin. And now turning to Jennifer, What do you find most rewarding about working with data in your new role at Closer, but also in your previous roles working with data, particularly in terms of improving inclusivity?
I think, we're really just scratching the surface of what open science and open educational resources and open data resources can do for improving inclusivity and access actually in the research community. So, and I'm thinking specifically about researchers who might not have access to such highly developed infrastructures like the ones we have in the United Kingdom. And one of the things that gives me deep satisfaction is that all of the resources from Closer are open access. So researchers from anywhere in the world, at any university, at any stage in their career can access our metadata search engine discovery. Likewise, they can partake of our education and training modules on our website, or people who want to learn more about knowledge mobilization can access our knowledge mobilization materials, including guides for how to impact policy. And that gives me a great satisfaction because I know that I'm spending a huge amount of time deeply invested in work that's actually openly available for everybody to use. With the Growing Up in Digital Europe Consortium guide, I think a real satisfaction there is actually working with researchers from across Europe who are coming from lots of different fields. So we work with epidemiologists, demographers, economists, anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists, and medical researchers to some extent as well, to come together to really talk about the issues that need to be discussed to try to design a survey instrument that's going to have the best possible outcome in terms of producing data that's going to be impactful for changing young people's lives for the better. So working together with a group, a consortium, has been incredibly satisfying. And I think in my other research, just producing data that's actually gone on to impact policy and change the education system in Ireland. I mean, that's an incredibly privileged position to be in as an individual, to have a role in these kinds of things. So it's been very satisfying, very rewarding.
It's really great to have such an amazing amount of experience between you all to share with us for this podcast. Thank you so much to all our panellists for sharing their experiences with us today and providing a lot of fascinating insight into how rewarding it can be working with data. It's particularly interesting to hear about the sheer variety of work that a career in data can provide to anyone who's considering embarking on that career path. Although that's all we have time for in our first episode of the Experts Expert podcast for Love Data Week 2024, please tune in to episodes 2 and 3 to hear about the power of data and data for good. In these next episodes, our panellists talk about the impact of data and discuss how, in the emerging world of AI and more convincing fake news, data can provide a safe place for sourcing trusted information.